Time, 1936, August 1945. Dates: M1 Garand adopted by U.S. Army, 1936 Guadalcanal landing. August 7, 1942 Henderson Field battle. October 24 to 25, 1942, Marines officially adopt M1 Garand. 1943 Peleliu. September 15, 1944 Iwo Jima. February 19, 1945 Okinawa. April 1, 1945. Locations: Springfield Armory, Massachusetts, Camp Elliott, California, Camp Pendleton, California, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, Henderson Field, Peleliu, Palau Islands, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Weather: Guadalcanal, tropical heat, humidity, jungle rainfall, Peleliu, extreme heat, coral dust, Okinawa. Torrential rain, 17 inches in 15 days, Iwo Jima. Cold, black volcanic ash. Units involved: 1st Marine Division, 5th Marine Regiment, 7th Marine Regiment, 3rd Battalion. 5th Marines, K Company, 1st Battalion. 7th Marines, 4th Marine Division, 5th Marine Division, 3rd Defense Battalion. U.S. Army reinforcements, October 1942. The rifle that changed infantry combat in the Pacific War was not designed for war. It was designed during the Great Depression by a Canadian immigrant named John C. Garand, a self-taught machinist working at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, who spent years solving a problem that every military in the world understood, but none had managed to fix: how to build a semi-automatic rifle that was reliable enough, simple enough, and robust enough to be issued to every soldier in an army. Garand's solution was a gas-operated system that used the pressure from a fired cartridge to cycle the action, eject the spent casing, and chamber the next round automatically, allowing the soldier to fire 8 shots as fast as he could pull the trigger without ever touching the bolt. The United States Army adopted the M1 Garand in 1936. By 1941, it was standard issue. By the time the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the weapon had been in production for 5 years, and almost nobody outside the military understood what it meant to equip an entire infantry force with a semi-automatic rifle when every other army in the world was still using bolt actions. The M1 Garand weighed 9.5 pounds empty, 10.2 pounds loaded. It was 43.6 inches long with a 24-inch barrel. It fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, a full-power rifle round with a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, and it fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip that locked into the internal magazine from the top. When the last round was fired, the clip ejected automatically with a distinctive metallic ping that every soldier who ever carried the weapon remembered for the rest of his life. The effective range was 500 yards. The rate of fire, for an experienced shooter, was 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute. A trained infantryman with a bolt-action rifle, the Japanese Type 38 Arisaka, for example, could fire 10 to 15 rounds per minute if he was very good and did not need to aim carefully. The arithmetic was not subtle. An American rifleman with an M1 Garand could put 3 to 4 times as many bullets down range in the same amount of time, and he could do it without breaking his sight picture or his firing stance because the rifle cycled itself. The United States Marine Corps, which prided itself on marksmanship and tradition, was slower to adopt the M1 Garand than the Army. Marines loved the M1903 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle that was older, heavier, and more accurate at long range than the Garand, and which had served them well since World War I. When the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, the 3 infantry regiments, the 1st, 5th, and 7th Marines, were still carrying the M1903. Only the 3rd Defense Battalion, a specialized unit, brought 250 M1 Garands. The Marines who carried the Springfields did not complain. They trusted the weapon. They knew how to use it, and they had no direct experience with what it was like to face an enemy at close range in the jungle, when the difference between surviving and dying came down to who could fire faster. That experience came in October. Corporal Eugene B. Sledge, who would later write one of the defining memoirs of the Pacific War, arrived at Marine Corps boot camp in 1943 and was issued an M1 Garand along with the rest of his individual equipment. A corporal named Doherty walked down the line reading off assignments. Eugene B. Sledge 534559, full individual equipment, an M1 rifle, infantry, Camp Elliott. Sledge helped load the gear onto the trucks and noticed that most of the recruits in his group were being assigned to infantry. It did not occur to him, in that moment, why so many young men were being funneled into rifle companies. The casualties on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Palilio were mounting faster than replacements could be trained, and the Marine Corps needed riflemen more than it needed anything else. Sledge would carry the M1 Garand, and later an M1 carbine, through some of the worst fighting of the war. He would learn what the weapon could do and what it could not do. He would also learn what it meant to fire it at another human being at ranges so close that you could see their face. The transition from bolt action to semi-automatic was not universally welcomed, even among those who benefited from it. Some Marines argued that the semi-automatic mechanism encouraged wastefulness, that soldiers would fire too quickly, burn through ammunition, and lose the discipline that came from having to work the bolt between shots. Some worried that the weapon was too complicated, that it would jam in the mud and sand and salt water of the Pacific Islands, where every piece of equipment corroded faster than it could be maintained. And some simply did not trust anything new. The M1903 Springfield had been good enough for their fathers. It had been good enough at Belleauwood. Why change? The answer came in the form of combat reports from Guadalcanal, where Army reinforcements arrived in October 1942 carrying M1 Garands and demonstrated, in firefights that lasted seconds, what the difference in firepower actually meant. Lieutenant Colonel George, an Army officer who arrived with the reinforcements, looked at the Marines still carrying bolt actions and said something that was both tactless and true. The old gun is simply obsolete, that's all. John Garand never received royalties for the rifle that bore his name. He was a government employee, and the weapon he designed belonged to the United States. He worked through the Depression on a machinist salary, refining the gas system, testing prototypes, fixing problems that emerged only after thousands of rounds had been fired. The final design was elegant in its simplicity: a rotating bolt, a gas piston, an operating rod, and an 8-round en-bloc clip that could be loaded in a single motion by pressing it down into the receiver until it clicked. The bolt closed automatically. The rifle was ready to fire. Soldiers in training learned to load the weapon properly, or they learned the hard way. The bolt spring was powerful enough to close with sufficient force that if a soldier's thumb was still in the way when the bolt came forward, the result was immediate and painful. The injury was common enough to have a name: M1 thumb. The thumbnail turned black and often fell off within a month. Boot camp instructors demonstrated the proper technique: heel of the hand against the operating rod, thumb depressing the clip follower, then removed smartly. And they did it over and over until recruits could do it without thinking. One Marine gunnery sergeant, demonstrating the manual of arms, caught his thumb in the bolt during an inspection and, according to men who were there, cursed in fluent Japanese. The sound of the M1 Garand was distinctive. The crack of the .30-06 cartridge was louder and sharper than the Japanese Arisaka, and in confined spaces of jungle fighting the noise was disorienting to anyone on the receiving end. The recoil was manageable but substantial, enough that a soldier firing rapidly had to brace himself or risk losing his sight picture. The barrel heated quickly. After a full magazine, the metal was too hot to touch. The smell of cordite and gun oil became inseparable from the weapon itself, and veterans decades later could identify an M1 Garand by smell alone if they were handed one in the dark. The rifle was not perfect. It was heavy. It was long. It was poorly suited to close-quarters combat in bunkers or caves where a shorter weapon like the M1 carbine or a Thompson submachine gun was more practical. But in open ground, in defensive positions, in any situation where a soldier had time to aim and fire repeatedly, the M1 Garand was unmatched by anything the Japanese carried. The Japanese Type 38 and Type 99 Arisaka rifles were bolt-action weapons feeding from a 5-round internal magazine. They were accurate, reliable, and well-made. Japanese soldiers were trained to a high standard of marksmanship, and in the hands of a skilled shooter, the Arisaka was a deadly weapon. But it required the shooter to work the bolt manually after every shot. Pull back, eject the spent casing, chamber a new round, close the bolt, re-aim, fire. In the time it took a Japanese soldier to fire 5 rounds, an American with an M1 Garand could fire 8, reload, and fire 8 more. In a firefight that lasted 30 seconds, the difference was the difference between surviving and not surviving. The Japanese understood this. After early engagements on Guadalcanal, captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that Japanese officers were reporting American firepower as something beyond what their tactical manuals had prepared them for. They used words like impossible to describe the volume of fire coming from American rifle squads. If you're following this story, take a moment to like and subscribe. What happens next at Henderson Field is the reason the M1 Garand became legend. By October 1942, the Marines on Guadalcanal were exhausted, sick, and running low on everything except determination. They held Henderson Field, the airstrip that gave them air superiority over the island, and the Japanese wanted it back. On the night of October 24th, the Japanese launched a major offensive with 3,000 men from the elite Sendai Division, moving to the jungle in the dark toward a high ground south of the airfield. The sector they chose to attack was defended by 2 battalions of Marines, including elements of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller. Among those Marines was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, a machine gunner from Raritan, New Jersey, who had enlisted before the war and had a reputation among his men as someone who did not panic and did not quit. Basilone commanded 2 machine gun sections positioned at a place the Marines called Coffin Corner, a narrow ridge with fields of fire covering the approaches to Henderson Field. He had been fighting for 3 days with almost no sleep. He was barefooted because his boots had rotted off. His eyes were red from exhaustion and coral dust. When the Japanese attacked just after 10 in the evening, Basilone was at his guns. The attack came in waves. Japanese soldiers screaming, "Banzai! Banzai!" and running directly at the Marine positions, throwing themselves over barbed wire, forming human bridges with their bodies so that the men behind them could cross. Basilone's machine guns opened fire and did not stop. When one gun jammed, he cleared it. When another ran out of ammunition, he ran through enemy fire to bring more. When the barrels overheated, he changed them with his bare hands. Private First Class Nash Phillips, who was there, later said, "Basilone had a machine gun on the go for 3 days and nights without sleep, rest, or food. He was in a good emplacement and causing the Japanese lots of trouble, not only firing his machine gun, but also using his pistol." Historian Eric Hamill wrote that Basilone became the glue that bound Company C together, moving from position to position, calming gunners, repositioning weapons, doing whatever needed to be done to hold the line. At dawn, the attack stopped. 38 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of Basilone's position. Only 3 Marines from his section survived. Basilone rested his head on the edge of the fighting hole and closed his eyes. The line had held. The Medal of Honor citation that was written for John Basilone months later described his actions in the clinical language that military awards use to translate chaos into something that could be typed onto paper and signed by senior officers. It said that he fought with daring initiative and valiant efforts, and that his conduct was in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. What it did not say was that Basilone had fought for 3 days and nights without sleep in conditions that broke men who were stronger and better rested, that he had cleared jam machine guns under fire while Japanese soldiers were close enough to throw grenades at him, or that when his ammunition ran out he fought with an M1911 pistol and a machete until resupply arrived. The men who survived Henderson Field did not need the citation to know what Basilone had done. They had been there. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, who commanded the battalion, and who was not known for sentimentality, pushed hard for Basilone to receive the Medal of Honor because Puller understood that what had happened on that ridge was the kind of thing that determined whether a position held or collapsed, and that the difference between those two outcomes was often a single man who refused to stop. Basilone received the medal on May 21st, 1943, at a ceremony in Australia. He stood in front of officers and journalists and accepted the award with a particular discomfort of a man who believed that medals belonged to the living and the dead equally, and that the dead deserved more recognition than he did. He said, simply, "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The officers present understood that Basilone was referring to men whose names would never appear in citations, men who had died holding a rifle or a machine gun in the dark, while Japanese soldiers screamed and charged and died in front of them. Basilone was sent back to the United States after Guadalcanal for a war bond tour. He married a Marine sergeant named Lena Mae Ridgey in July 1944 at a small church in Oceanside, California. He requested to return to combat. His request was granted. On February 19, 1945, he landed on Iwo Jima with the 5th Marine Division and was killed on the morning of the first day after destroying a blockhouse and guiding a trapped Sherman tank through a minefield. He was 27 years old. The M1 Garand that Basilone and thousands of other Marines carried into combat by 1943 had become the standard infantry weapon of the Marine Corps, replacing the M1903 Springfield in all but specialized roles. The official table of organization for a Marine division in 1943, the D-Series structure, called for 7,406 M1 Garands, 5,285 M1 carbines, and 456 M1903 Springfield rifles reserved for snipers and grenadiers. The transition was complete. The Marines who had landed on Guadalcanal with bolt actions were now carrying semi-automatics, and the difference in firepower was measurable not just in rounds per minute, but in the confidence that came from knowing you could keep shooting without having to work a bolt under fire. That confidence mattered in the kind of fighting the Pacific War produced. Close-range engagements in jungle, coral, and caves where visibility was measured in yards and reaction time in fractions of a second. Corporal Eugene Sledge, who had been issued his M1 Garand at Camp Elliott and trained with it until the manual of arms became automatic, landed on Peleliu on September 15, 1944, as part of K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Peleliu was supposed to take 4 days. It took 2 months. The Japanese had fortified the island with a system of caves, tunnels, and reinforced bunkers that American intelligence had not fully appreciated, and the fighting became a grinding, brutal struggle that destroyed units and broke men in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone who had not been there. Sledge carried a mortar, not a rifle, but he watched the riflemen in his company work their M1 Garands in conditions that tested every piece of equipment the Marines brought to the island. The heat was extreme. The coral dust got into everything. Water was rationed. Sleep was intermittent. The Japanese defended every position until they were killed, and they did not surrender. Sledge later wrote, "The world was a nightmare of flashes, explosions, and snapping bullets." The M1 Garand performed well on Peleliu, but it was not immune to the environment. Coral dust worked its way into the action and caused stoppages. Salt water corroded metal faster than soldiers could clean and oil the weapon. The en-bloc clip system, which allowed for fast reloading, also meant that a partially expended clip could not be topped off without ejecting it entirely and losing the remaining rounds. In a firefight, that limitation was not critical. Soldiers learned to fire all 8 rounds and reload quickly. But in ambush situations or when ammunition was scarce, the inability to top off a magazine was a tactical disadvantage that the M1903 Springfield, which charge-loaded internal magazine, did not have. Sledge noticed these things because he was trained to notice them, because survival in combat depended on understanding what your weapons could and could not do. He also noticed that the men who carried M1 Garands trusted them in a way that went beyond technical specifications. They knew the weapon would fire when they pulled the trigger, and in the Pacific War, where equipment failed constantly and resupply was never guaranteed, that reliability was worth more than any advantage on paper. The sound of an M1 Garand in combat was louder and more sustained than anything the Japanese expected from individual riflemen. Japanese soldiers were trained to recognize the difference between machine gun fire and rifle fire, and their tactics were built around the assumption that rifles fired slowly, one round at a time, with pauses for reloading. The M1 Garand violated that assumption. A single American rifleman could produce a volume of fire that sounded like a light machine gun, and Japanese soldiers attacking at night, when visual identification was impossible, could not always distinguish between a rifle squad and a machine gun position until they were already committed to the assault. The result was that banzai charges, which relied on speed and shock to overwhelm defensive positions before the defenders could react, ran into walls of semi-automatic fire that cut them down faster than Japanese commanders had planned for. The casualties were catastrophic. After-action reports from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan documented Japanese attacks that dissolved under sustained rifle fire, with bodies piled in front of Marine positions in numbers that indicated the attackers had not adjusted their tactics to account for American firepower. The ping of the ejected en-bloc clip became one of the most debated characteristics of the M1 Garand, both during the war and afterward. The sound was audible at close range, and there was a persistent belief among some soldiers that Japanese troops learned to listen for it and would rush forward when they heard it, assuming the American rifleman was out of ammunition and vulnerable. The reality was more complicated. A survey conducted by the U.S. Army in Korea in 1952 asked soldiers whether the noise from the ejected clip was a tactical liability. The report concluded, the noise caused by ejection of the empty clip from the M1, despite the fact that at close range it could be heard by the enemy, was considered valuable by the riflemen as a signal to reload. The soldiers themselves saw it as an advantage, not a vulnerability. Some threw empty clips deliberately to trick the enemy into thinking they were reloading. The battlefield was loud: mortars, machine guns, grenades, small arms fire, and the idea that an enemy soldier could pick out the specific sound of an M1 Garand clip ejecting in the middle of a firefight and then react tactically was, in most cases, unrealistic. But the myth persisted, and veterans argued about it for decades. If you've been following this documentary, please take a moment to like and subscribe. What comes next in Okinawa? And Iwo Jima shows what happened when the weapon met the worst conditions of the entire war. By the time the Marines landed on Okinawa on April 1st, 1945, the M1 Garand had been in combat for 3 years, and the lessons learned had been incorporated into training, tactics, and maintenance procedures. Soldiers knew how to load the weapon without getting M1 thumb. They knew how to clear stoppages quickly. They knew to keep the gas port clean and the action lubricated. They also knew that the weapon had limitations. The M1 carbine, which was lighter and shorter, was preferred by some Marines for jungle and cave fighting where maneuverability mattered more than range. Sledge, who carried a mortar most of the time, occasionally picked up an M1 Garand when his own weapon was not needed. On Okinawa, in the rain and mud that turned the entire island into a swamp, he found that the M1 Garand held up better than the M1 carbine. The carbine was more prone to jamming in wet conditions. The Garand, with its robust gas system and heavier construction, kept firing. Sledge wrote, "It was the essence of violence and of man's inhumanity to man." Okinawa rained for weeks. 17 inches fell in 15 days. The ground turned to mud that swallowed boots and equipment. Rifles became caked in filth. Sledge recalled finding an M1 Garand that someone had left behind, cleaner and drier than his own weapon, and he picked up and used it because it was in better condition than what he had. That was the reality of infantry combat. You used what worked. You kept moving. You did not stop to think about the larger strategic picture, because the larger strategic picture did not matter when you were standing in mud up to your knees trying to keep your rifle functioning long enough to survive the next firefight. Sledge's account of the war, written decades later at the urging of his wife, remains one of the most honest descriptions of what combat in the Pacific actually felt like. He did not romanticize it. He did not simplify it. He wrote, "Fear and filth went hand in hand. It has always puzzled me that this important factor in our daily lives has received so little attention from historians. Iwo Jima presented a different problem. The island was covered in black volcanic ash that got into everything: weapons, food, clothing, lungs. The ash was fine enough to penetrate the action of an M1 Garand and cause stoppages if the weapon was not cleaned constantly. Marines landing on the beaches on February 19, 1945, found that their rifles jammed within minutes of coming ashore. The M1 carbines were even worse. The ash clogged the gas ports, and the smaller tolerances of the carbine's action made it more vulnerable to fouling. Riflemen switched to M1 Garands when they could because the Garand's heavier construction and larger gas piston were more resistant to the ash. Harold Schultz, a private first class with the 5th Marine Division, carried an M1 Garand on Iwo Jima and was photographed with it slung over his shoulder in the iconic image of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. The photograph shows the rifle clearly: barrel, stock, sling, and it became one of the most reproduced images of the war. Schultz did not talk about the photograph much afterward. He was not interested in being famous. He had carried the rifle because that was his job. He had raised the flag because that was what he was told to do. The weapon and the moment were inseparable, but the weapon was just a tool, and the moment was just one moment in a battle that killed 7,000 Americans and 21,000 Japanese. The tactical advantage of the M1 Garand was never more apparent than in night attacks, when Japanese forces relied on speed, surprise, and close combat to negate American firepower. On Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, on Saipan, Japanese commanders ordered banzai charges, mass frontal assaults intended to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers and willingness to die. The attacks were conducted at night, often without artillery preparation, and relied on hand-to-hand combat once the attackers reached American lines. The M1 Garand disrupted this tactic in ways that Japanese planners had not anticipated. A Marine rifleman in a defensive position could fire 8 rounds in rapid succession, reload in under 2 seconds, and continue firing without pause. A squad of 10 Marines with M1 Garands could deliver sustained semi-automatic fire that was functionally equivalent to 2 or 3 light machine guns. Japanese soldiers charging through that fire did not reach the Marine lines. They died in front of them. The bodies piled up. The attacks failed. And Japanese officers, reading the casualty reports, could not understand how American riflemen were producing that much firepower with individual weapons. The weapon John Garand designed in the 1930s had become, by 1945, the defining characteristic of American infantry combat power. It was not the only factor: artillery, air support, logistics, and leadership all mattered, but it was a factor that gave individual soldiers an edge in the kind of close-range, high-intensity fighting that the Pacific War produced. The Japanese fought with discipline, courage, and a willingness to die that American forces respected and feared. But they fought with bolt-action rifles that required manual operation between shots, and in a war where seconds mattered, that difference was lethal. By the end of the war, 5.4 million M1 Garands had been produced. The weapon remained in service through Korea and into the early years of Vietnam. It was eventually replaced by the M14, which was essentially an updated Garand with a detachable magazine and select fire capability. But the soldiers who carried the M1 Garand in World War II remembered it as the weapon that kept them alive, and they did not forget it. The end of the war did not erase what the M1 Garand had done or what the men who carried it had experienced. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the Marines and soldiers who fought across the Pacific returned home with the rifles still in their hands, or still in their memories, or still present in the way they flinched at sudden noises, or woke up at night reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. Eugene Sledge came home from Okinawa and tried to return to civilian life, but he found that the distance between what he had seen and what people at home understood was too great to bridge with ordinary conversation. He did not talk about the war for decades. When he finally wrote about it, at the urging of his wife Jean, he did so because he felt an obligation to the men he had served with, the ones who survived and the ones who did not. He wrote, In writing, I am fulfilling an obligation I have long felt to my comrades in the 1st Marine Division, all of whom suffered so much for our country. None came out unscathed. Many gave their lives, many their health, and some their sanity. The M1 Garand itself became a symbol of American military power in a way that transcended its technical specifications. General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and while that statement was hyperbole, tanks, artillery, and aircraft all had stronger claims to decisive impact. It reflected something real about how the weapon was perceived by the men who used it and the commanders who relied on it. The rifle had given American infantry a firepower advantage that no other nation's standard-issue weapon could match during World War II. The Soviet Tokarev SVT-40 was semi-automatic, but it was issued in limited numbers and was less reliable in harsh conditions. The German Gur 43 was effective, but came too late in the war to change outcomes. The British, French, and Japanese all fought the war with bolt-action rifles. Only the United States equipped every infantryman with a semi-automatic weapon as standard issue, and that decision, made years before the war began, had consequences that rippled through every engagement where American forces fought. The firepower advantage translated directly into casualty ratios in certain types of combat. On Guadalcanal, during the October 1942 battles for Henderson Field, Japanese forces attacked in waves designed to overwhelm Marine positions through numerical superiority and close combat. The attacks failed. Post-battle assessments counted Japanese dead in the hundreds, while Marine casualties, though significant, were proportionally lower. The difference was not morale or training alone. Japanese soldiers were well-trained and fought with extraordinary determination. The difference was that Marines with M1 Garands could fire faster, reload faster, and sustain fire longer than Japanese soldiers with bolt-action Arisakas. In a night attack where visibility was limited and engagements happened at ranges of 10 to 50 yards, the ability to fire 8 rounds in quick succession without working a bolt was the difference between holding a position and being overrun. Japanese commanders recognized this. Captured document from later in the war showed that Japanese officers were instructing their troops to close distance as quickly as possible, to use grenades and bayonets, and to avoid prolonged firefights where American firepower could be brought to bear. The tactics adapted, but the fundamental problem remained. The weapon had limitations that became more apparent as the war progressed, and as soldiers accumulated experience with it under different conditions. The en-bloc clip system, while fast load, could not be topped off without ejecting the entire clip and losing any remaining rounds. This was not a significant problem in most firefights, but in ambush situations or during long patrols where ammunition conservation mattered, it was a disadvantage. The rifle was also heavy, 9.5 pounds empty, and after miles of patrolling through jungle or coral, that weight became exhausting. The M1 carbine, which weighed 5.5 pounds, was preferred by some Marines for that reason alone, even though it fired a less powerful cartridge and had shorter effective range. Sledge, who carried both weapons at different times, noted that the choice often came down to mission and terrain. If you expected close quarters fighting in caves or bunkers, the carbine was better. If you expected open ground or defensive positions, the Garand was better. There was no perfect weapon. There were only weapons that worked in specific situations, and soldiers who understood which weapon to use when. The M1 Garand also required maintenance in a way that bolt-action rifles did not. The gas system that made the weapon semi-automatic also made it more complex. The gas pour had to be kept clean or the rifle would short stroke, fail to cycle completely, and jam. The operating rod had to be lubricated but not over-lubricated because too much oil attracted dirt and caused failures. The bolt had to be inspected regularly for wear. In the field, under combat conditions, maintenance was a constant struggle. Soldiers cleaned their weapons whenever they had time, which was often not enough. Salt water, coral dust, volcanic ash, mud, and rain all worked against the weapon's reliability. And yet, despite these challenges, the M1 Garand kept working. It was robust enough to function in conditions that would have disabled more delicate weapons, And that robustness was not an accident. John Garand had designed the rifle to be soldier-proof, simple enough that a conscript with minimal training could operate and maintain it, and tough enough that it would keep functioning even when neglected. The cost of the rifle during the war was $85 per unit, which seems absurdly low by modern standards, but represented a significant investment when multiplied across millions of weapons. The United States produced 5.4 million M1 Garands between 1937 and 1957. The production was spread across multiple contractors, with Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms producing the majority. The manufacturing process was refined over time, with tolerances tightened and quality control improved as production scaled up. By 1943, the weapon being issued to recruits was more reliable and better made than the early production models, though the fundamental design remained unchanged. Garand himself never received royalties. He was a government employee, and the patents belonged to the United States. He retired from Springfield Armory in 1953 and lived quietly until his death in 1974. He did not become famous. He did not seek recognition. He had solved a problem, and the solution had worked, and that was enough. The human cost of the Pacific War cannot be separated from the weapons that were used to fight it. The M1 Garand killed Japanese soldiers efficiently, at ranges and rates of fire that made survival for the enemy improbable once contact was made. Those soldiers were human beings, many of them conscripts, many of them fighting because they had no choice, many of them believing in the cause they served or simply believing in their duty to their country and their comrades. The weapon did not distinguish between a fanatical believer in imperial expansion and a scared teenager who had been drafted and sent to die on an island he had never heard of. It fired when the trigger was pulled. It killed whoever was in front of it. The Marines and soldiers who carried the M1 Garand understood this in ways that were difficult to articulate afterward. They had killed men. They had done it efficiently. And the efficiency of it, the mechanical simplicity of pointing a rifle and pulling a trigger 8 times in quick succession, did not make the act less morally complex. It made it easier to do and harder to forget. Eugene Sledge wrote about the psychological cost of killing in his memoir, and he did not soften it or make it easier to read. He described the moment when a fellow Marine mutilated a Japanese corpse, extracting gold teeth with a K-bar knife while the man was still barely alive. Sledge watched it happen and felt something break inside himself, not outrage at the cruelty, but a recognition that war had made cruelty normal, expected, unremarkable. He wrote, "The Japanese fought to win. It was a savage, brutal, inhumane, exhausting, and dirty business." He did not justify what he had seen. He simply recorded it, because recording was the only way to make sure it was not forgotten or sanitized by people who had not been there. The M1 Garand was part of that reality. It was a tool that made the killing possible at a scale and speed that defined the infantry combat of the Pacific War. And the men who used it carried the weight of what they had done for the rest of their lives, whether they talked about it or not. John Basilone, who had fought at Henderson Field with a machine gun and an M1911 pistol and whatever else was available, returned to combat on Iwo Jima and was killed on the first day. He was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for his actions guiding a tank through a minefield and destroying a blockhouse with grenades and demolition charges. The citation noted his dauntless courage and valiant leadership, but the men who had served with him on Guadalcanal remembered something else. They remembered that Basilone had not been and quitting would have been understandable. They had held a position of holding the team hostage. They had done it not because he was fearless, but because the men around him needed him to. The M1 Garand had not been Basilone's primary weapon in the field. He was a machine gun, but it was a weapon that the riflemen around him carried. And their ability to sustain fire had been part of what allowed them to weapons and men were inseparable in combat. The weapon multiplied the man's effectiveness. The man made the weapon meaningful. The legacy of the M1 Garand is not simple. It was a brilliant piece of engineering that gave American forces a decisive advantage in infantry combat. It was also a tool for killing that worked exactly as designed, and the people it killed were human beings with families and futures that ended abruptly when a .30-06 round struck them. The rifle remained in service long after World War II ended. It was used in Korea, where it proved effective against Chinese and North Korean forces. It was used in the early years of Vietnam. It was eventually replaced by the M14 and then by the M16, but veterans who had carried it in World War II argued for decades that no subsequent weapon matched its reliability or its feel. They remembered the weight of it, the sound of it, the way it kicked when you fired it, and the distinctive ping of the ejected clip. They remembered cleaning in the dark, loading it under fire, and trusting it to work when their lives depended on it. And they remembered the man who had carried it beside them and who had not come home. What does it mean to give soldiers a weapon that allows them to kill more efficiently? What does it mean to design that weapon during peacetime, knowing it will be used in war, and to spend years perfecting it so that it works reliably under the worst conditions imaginable? What does it mean to be the soldier who carries it, who uses it to survive, and who then has to live with the knowledge of what he did with it? These are not questions the M1 Garand answers. They are questions the M1 Garand raises and leaves open for every generation that inherits the world it helped to shape. The rifle was a tool. The men who used it were human. And the war they fought with it was both necessary and terrible in ways that do not resolve cleanly into narratives of heroism or tragedy. It was simply what happened, recorded in blood and memory, and the cold mechanical precision of a weapon that fired 8 rounds without hesitation, and then asked for more. Commanders: Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, Commanding General, 1st Marine Division, Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Colonel Louis B. Chesty Puller, Battalion Commander, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, Guadalcanal. Major General Clifton B. Cates, Commanding General, 4th Marine Division, Iwo Jima. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, Medal of Honor, Guadalcanal, killed Iwo Jima February 19, 1945. Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page, Medal of Honor, Guadalcanal, October 26, 1942. Corporal Anthony Casamento, Medal of Honor, Machine Gun Section Leader, Guadalcanal. Corporal Eugene B. Sledgehammer, Sledge, K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, Mortarman, Peleliu, and Okinawa. Corporal R.V. Bergen, K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Private First Class Mario Snafu Shelton, K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Private First Class Nash W. Phillips, witnessed Basilone's actions, Guadalcanal. Private First Class Harold Schultz, 5th Marine Division, Iwo Jima flag-raising photograph. Corporal Anthony DiCristoforo, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. Sniper, Guadalcanal. Robert Leckie, 1st Marine Division, author, Helmet from My Pillow. Lieutenant Colonel George, U.S. Army, Reinforcement Officer, Guadalcanal, October 1942. John C. Garand, Designer, Springfield Armory. Lena Mae Ridgey, Sergeant, Marine Corps Women's Reserve, married John Basilone, July 1944.